Hello and welcome back to another update where I cover the latest developments throughout the front line in the Russo-Ukrainian war. It is your host Weeb Union, and in this one the Russians have managed to make several advances on the eastern section of the front line. In the southern section of the front line they've managed to capture the majority of RUAF, as is seen with geolocated footage. The Russians also managed to advance in the southern flank of Chasiv Yar, north of Donetsk. The Russians made numerous advances to the southwest of Pokrovsk and in the southwestern outskirts of the Donetsk region. They also managed to advance in the eastern section of the Zaporizhia region, where they managed to gain a foothold within the town of Melinivka. Starting out in the southern parts of the front line, the Russians crossed over the river line, gaining a foothold within Melinivka. They managed to cross over the river line from the south and from the east through the main road. They also managed to gain control over the farm area and the first residential area, half of the street in the southern parts of Melinivka. The Russians are here attempting to establish a foothold within the town, expanding in a western and northern direction to create a safe zone for their forces in the southern outskirts of the town. With this crossing, the Russians are here storming the town itself to gain full control of it. Establishing themselves on the western bank and northern bank of the river line will allow them to start offensive operations in the direction of Zeleny to the west, Vysoke and Vesele to the north and south of the town, and further up north in the direction of Poltavka. The objective of the Russians will be to establish a proper foothold across the river line for future offensive operations on the eastern flank of Ulyaipole, which is a major supply hub for Ukrainian forces alongside the first line of defense in the Zaporizhia region. Further north, the Russians managed to make several advances to the southwest of Vesele along the first line of defense here into the Donetsk region, where they are fighting over the fortifications of the Ukrainians. They also managed to advance within Komar, where the Russian Ministry of Defense actually announced the complete capture of the town. However, so far there's been no evidence of that. The Russians managed to advance within the town itself to gain control over the central and eastern parts of it following the capture of the fortified positions, which established an additional supply line into the town. Now fighting is taking place over Perebudova, here from the northeast, and directly from the south as the Russians fight over the remaining parts of the town. Further northeast, the Russians secured the western outskirts of Oleksivka, gaining full control over the town, advanced to gain control over the farm area just outside of the town, and reached the outskirts of Zeleny in offensive operations on the northern bank of the Vovcha River line. The Russians are here working on gaining control over the entire border area between the Donetsk and Dnipropetrovsk region and capturing the fortified positions by advancing through the towns and settlements while attacking the flank of the Ukrainian forces by attempting to strike their supply lines, as they have done with the foothold within the Dnipropetrovsk region, cutting off the main supply route. Just north of this, the Russians also managed to advance west of Kotlyarivka as they reached the border area here north of Horihove. Extremely heavy fighting is taking place within Horihove as the Ukrainians are unable to withdraw from the town as they do not have any safe roads. Instead, it is a large area of open fields where they are exposed. The Ukrainians are attempting to hold a last stand within the town as the Russian forces storm it from the north and from the east. Gaining control over Horihove will open the road for the Russian forces to enter the Dnipropetrovsk region through these fields in the direction of Novopavlivka and to flank Moravka from the south, combined with assaults on the fortified positions from the north. It will allow the Russians to expand in every single direction. The Ukrainian positions in Moravka are exposed to Russian forces in the east and now also Russian forces to the south as they try to hold their final town here in the western outskirts of the Donetsk region, up to the Dnipropetrovsk region east of Novopavlivka, which connects one of the road that connects to the town for Russian offensive operations towards it to establish themselves within the Dnipropetrovsk region. To the east of Pokrovsk, the Russians managed to make some advances here along the Canal, where they gain control over the crossing here west of Kordyomivka and are fighting over the fortified positions of the Ukrainians along the canal. The Russians also expanding zone of control east of the Livka as they are storming the first line from the eastern and southern directions. The Russians are here looking to gain control over the first lines and fortifications along the canal crossing to reach the second crossing here northwest of Kordyomivka. Having additional crossings will allow the Russians to expand their zone of control along the canal and to establish stronger forces across the canal. Gaining control over the forest lines here to the east of Delivka will allow the Russians to advance in the direction of Bilahora, gaining an additional supply route to the frontline positions of the Ukrainians near Delivka and Bilahora. The Russians will here look to expand the zone of control south of Delivka to storm the town itself and establish additional supply lines into the town and Bilahora for a wide assault. The Russians will also look to expand the zone of control along the Canal to connect with Chasiv Yar in the north, to gain control over these forest patches and additional crossings. Gaining full control over the entire canal here from Orlivka in the south to Chasiv Yar in the north will allow the Russians to significantly strengthen defensive operations to the southeast of Kostiantynivka. Further north in the direction of Ruarivka, the Russians managed to gain control over the trenches and fortified positions as well as the forest lines to the south of the town, and also advance within the western parts of the town where the Russians raised the flag, claiming full control over the town. However, the western outskirts still have a few Ukrainian positions in the basements and in the fortifications standing. The Russians will here look to gain full control over Ruarivka to open the road towards Serebrianka, gain control over the fortified positions and advance along the forest lines to the south. The objective of the Russians is to gain control over the fortified positions and towns east of the Siversk defensive line. We see that the Russians have gained control over half of these positions, leaving just a few on the western outskirts of Verkhnokamiansky and east of Serebrianka. If the Russians gain control of these remaining fortified positions and towns, they'll be able to start storming Siversk itself and the defensive line just outside the town. The Russians are struggling with the capture of the Serebriansky forest area, where the Ukrainians have the initiative. Therefore, they are looking to attack the forest through the flanks by gaining control over the northern and southern flank of the forest area. They can encircle the Ukrainian grouping of forces within it. However, this is a very large task, as it would require the capture of both Siversk and Liman, while the Ukrainians still hold on to the Serebriansky forest area, which they can make use of to flank any Russian attack, attacking their supply lines and setting up ambushes. This is why this section of the front line has faced a lot of difficulty. The further away from the Serebriansky forest area the Russians are, the easier time they've had to advance. In the northern section of the front line in the direction of Titkino, the front line has not moved since almost a week ago, since the 8th of June. It is reported by this Pravda Ukrainian media that the issues here rise from the lack of manpower and equipment used to launch this offensive. They're saying that the Ukrainian offensive in the Kushkova direction, in the direction of Titkino, has failed, and they are already moved to the defensive because they simply cannot advance anymore. They don't have the necessary vehicles to advance, and they do not have the necessary manpower to hold the front. At this point, they are heavily relying on FPV drones to hold their positions, and at the same time it is clear that the Russian push into the Sumy region is completely making this offensive irrelevant, and they are simply wasting time and personnel on this offensive into the Kursk region. The Ukrainians hold approximately 30 square kilometers of Russian Kursk territory, and that is really the only territory that they hold of Russian territory, while the Russians over the past few months have managed to capture 250 or so square kilometers in the Sumy region, on top of the 210 or 20 thereabout square kilometers north of Kharkiv, and over 1,000 square kilometers in the Kupiansk direction, while at the same time the Russians continue offensive operations in the east. This shows that the Ukrainian equipment is better used elsewhere, especially on defensive operations, to stop the Russian offensive. It is evident based on the recent developments that the Ukrainians are now forced to be on the defensive across the entire front line, not launching any offensive operations, while the Russians slowly speed up their own offensive operations, gaining control over 20 to 30 square kilometers a day over the past few months, and this will likely speed up as the Ukrainians lose more and more of their equipment and manpower and have to spread their forces thinly across the entire front line. And that is going to be all for this update. Thank you all for watching. Make sure to leave a like, subscribe, check out my Patreon and YouTube membership for additional content. Thank you all for watching and have a great day.